One man believed that eating sacred dirt would bring him back through reincarnation. Another wanted his body turned into fish food. These aren't just strange requests. They're the kind that left even execution officials speechless. From eerie predictions to requests for sex workers, these death row inmates made sure their final moments were just as disturbing as their crimes. James Edward Smith. On March 7, 1983, James Edward Smith entered the Union Life Insurance Company in Houston, Texas, wearing a mask and holding a loaded gun. His plan was simple: steal money and escape. But things quickly spiraled out of control. Inside, employee Deborah Renee Wilson was counting money when Smith demanded the cash. Panicked, she ducked behind a file cabinet. The district manager, Larry Don Rojos, stepped forward and handed over the money, hoping to prevent violence. But Smith wasn't satisfied. Without warning, he fired a single shot, hitting Rojos in the chest. The manager collapsed, dying shortly after. Smith tried to escape, but didn't make it far. Office workers and bystanders pinned him down in the parking lot until police arrived. The stolen money was recovered, and Smith was arrested for capital murder. At trial, Smith's erratic behavior shocked everyone. He attempted to escape the courtroom, but was quickly subdued. In 1984, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His legal battle took an unusual turn when his mother, Alexine Hamilton, argued that he was mentally incompetent. A temporary stay of execution was granted, but Smith himself did not fight for his life. In a strange twist, he actively sought death, rejecting further legal help and refusing to appeal. As his execution date neared, Smith made one of the strangest last meal requests in history. He asked for Rayacunda dirt, a type of sacred soil used in voodoo rituals. He believed that eating the dirt would aid in his reincarnation, allowing his spirit to move on after death. Prison officials denied the request, stating that dirt was not on the approved list of last meals. Instead, he was given a standard prison meal before his execution. On June 26, 1990, Smith was led to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. Strapped to the gurney, he remained composed as the lethal injection was prepared. In his final moments, he proclaimed, "I did not kill anyone," maintaining his innocence until the very end. He then referenced Hare Krishna beliefs, adding another layer of mystery to his spiritual journey. The drugs took effect, and his body soon fell still. James Edward Smith was pronounced dead. Gene Hathorn. In October 1984, Gene Hathorn and his friend James Lee Bethard planned a gruesome crime. Hoping to inherit $150,000, Hathorn wanted his father, Gene Sr., his stepmother, Linda, and his teenage half-brother, Marcus, dead. Believing he would soon get the money, Hathorn went through with the murders. To cover his tracks, he planted cigarette butts and African-American hair at the scene to mislead investigators. But the truth quickly surfaced. He and Bethard were arrested and charged with capital murder. During his trial, Hathorn claimed that Bethard was the real killer, saying he only fired through a window. The jury didn't believe him. In 1985, he was sentenced to death. Bethard was also convicted and later executed, never admitting guilt. Hathorn kept fighting his case, arguing that his father's abuse had fueled his actions. His legal battles dragged on for years. While facing execution, Hathorn made a bizarre request. He wanted his body to be turned into fish food and fed to goldfish as part of an art project. He had already made a deal with artist Marco Evaristi, who planned to freeze his remains, grind them into fish food, and use them in an exhibit about capital punishment. "If my appeal fails, let my body serve as a statement," Hathorn reportedly said. His request gained attention, sparking debate over whether executions should be used for artistic expression. In a twist of fate, Hathorn's appeal succeeded. Instead of execution, he was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison. His strange request was never carried out, and instead of becoming part of an art exhibit, he remained behind bars for the rest of his life. Victor Fager. Victor Fager was a drifter, moving from place to place without a steady job or direction. In 1960, he arrived in Dubuque, Iowa, and rented a room in a boarding house. It wasn't long before he turned to crime. His plan was simple, but deadly. Using the yellow pages, he called doctors one by one, claiming a woman needed urgent medical help. Eventually, he reached Dr. Edward Bartels, who agreed to assist. But when the doctor arrived, Fager kidnapped him, drove him across state lines into Illinois, and shot him in the head. Authorities later found Bartell's body dumped in a cornfield. Meanwhile, Feger was caught in Birmingham, Alabama, trying to sell the doctor's car. Investigators suspected that his real motive was to steal any drugs Bartell's might have carried, though Feger later claimed a mysterious Chicago drug addict was responsible for the crime. No evidence supported this claim. Because he had taken Bartell's across state lines, Feger faced federal charges. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Appeals were denied, leaving only President John F. Kennedy with the power to save him. Feger's attorney and even Iowa's governor pleaded for clemency, arguing that capital punishment should not be used. But Kennedy refused, calling the crime too brutal to ignore. On March 5, 1963, Feger was moved to the Iowa State Penitentiary at Fort Madison. He spent 10 days on death row, reportedly acting as a model prisoner. For his last meal, Feger made a simple but symbolic request. He asked for a single olive with the pit still in it. He told prison guards he hoped an olive tree would grow from his grave as a symbol of peace. Authorities granted his request. After eating the olive, he carefully placed the pit in his suit pocket. On March 15, 1963, Victor Feger was led to the gallows. Unlike most executions of the time, which used the electric chair, he was hanged. His body was later examined, and officials found the olive pit still tucked inside his suit pocket. 2 years later, the state abolished the death penalty, with Feger's hanging often cited as a reason for the decision. Thomas Douglas Arthur. On February 1, 1982, Troy Wicker was found shot to death in his home in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. The crime sent shockwaves through the small community, but even more shocking was the revelation that his wife, Judy Wicker, had allegedly paid a man to kill him. That man, according to her testimony, was Thomas Douglas Arthur, known as Tommy. She claimed to have offered him $10,000 to carry out the murder so she could collect her husband's life insurance. Arthur, however, insisted he was innocent. He had a criminal history, having previously been convicted in 1977 for murdering his sister-in-law, but he maintained he had nothing to do with Troy Wicker's death. His attorneys argued that Judy Wicker had accused him to avoid the death penalty herself, as she later testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. Arthur's case took a complicated turn when his first conviction was overturned. He was retried and convicted again, only for that ruling to be overturned as well. Finally, in 1991, after a third trial, he was sentenced to death. Despite his conviction, he never stopped fighting his case, claiming that the state had no physical evidence tying him to the crime. What made Arthur's case stand out wasn't just the years of appeals. It was how many times he came within hours of execution, only to have it halted at the last minute. His execution dates in 2001, twice in 2007, then again in 2008, 2012, 2015, and 2016 were all postponed. Some stays were granted due to legal challenges, while others were the result of broader debates over Alabama's execution methods. As his final execution date in May 2017 approached, Arthur made a request that shocked many. He asked not to be executed by lethal injection, arguing that his chronic back pain would make the process unbearably painful. Instead, he requested death by firing squad, believing it to be a quicker and less agonizing method. His plea was denied. Alabama did not offer a firing squad as an execution option, and his request was dismissed by the courts. He was left with no choice but to accept lethal injection. On May 26, 2017, at the age of 75, Thomas Douglas Arthur was led into the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility. Strapped to the gurney, he was asked for his final words. "I am innocent," he said, a claim he had maintained for 35 years. At 11:50 p.m., the lethal drugs were administered. His breathing slowed, and within minutes his body went still. At 12:15 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Patrick Bryan Knight. On August 27, 1991, Patrick Bryan Knight and his accomplice, Robert Bradfield, committed a brutal crime that left Amarillo, Texas, in shock. That evening, Walter and Mary Ann Werner arrived home from work, unaware that two men were lying in wait. Knight and Bradfield ambushed the couple, forcing them into their basement before tying them up. The attack was not random. Knight and Bradfield had planned to rob the Werners, taking their vehicles and ransacking their home. But their crimes didn't end there. The couple was blindfolded, gagged, and driven to a remote area in the Texas countryside. Forced to kneel, Walter and Mary Ann were each shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were dumped in a ditch, left for dead. Knight showed no remorse. After the killings, he calmly returned to his trailer, next door to the Werners' home, and went to sleep. The Werners' disappearance sparked an immediate investigation, leading law enforcement to Knight. Under questioning, he confessed and led authorities to the victims' bodies. His accomplice, Bradfield, was sentenced to life in prison. Knight, however, was sentenced to death in 1993. He spent the next 14 years on death row, appealing his sentence multiple times, but each appeal was denied. On June 26, 2007, Patrick Brian Knight was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. In the days leading up to his execution, he had claimed he would tell a joke as his last words. But when the moment arrived, his tone was different. "I said I was going to tell a joke," he said, his voice unsteady. "Death has set me free. That's the biggest joke. I deserve this." Near tears, he thanked his friends, expressed gratitude to God, and even made a plea for inmates he believed were innocent. Then, in a puzzling twist, he added, "I am not Patrick Brian Knight, and you all can't stop this execution now. Go ahead, I'm finished." The lethal injection was administered, and within minutes, Knight's body went still. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. Frank Atwood. On September 17, 1984, 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson left her home in Tucson, Arizona to mail a birthday card. It was a short walk, one she had done before, but this time she never returned. Hours turned into days, and panic spread through the community. What had started as a routine errand became a nightmare. Months later, her remains were discovered in the Arizona desert. The innocence of an entire community was shattered, and the search for her killer led authorities to Frank Atwood, a convicted pedophile with a history of child-related crimes. Atwood had already served time in California before moving to Arizona. Witnesses reported seeing his dark Datsun near Vicki's neighborhood on the day she vanished, and tire tracks at the scene of her abduction matched his vehicle. Though no direct physical evidence linked him to her death, the circumstantial case was enough. In 1987, he was convicted of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to die. Atwood's time on death row was marked by repeated appeals and legal challenges. He claimed innocence, arguing that the evidence was weak, and his legal team fought for a new trial. The process stretched on for decades. His execution was delayed in part due to a botched lethal injection in another case, which temporarily halted capital punishment in Arizona. Over the years, Atwood claimed to have changed. He converted to the Greek Orthodox faith, dedicating his time in prison to religious study and reflection. Supporters argued that he had become a different man, while Vicki's family continued to fight for justice, demanding the sentence be carried out. As his execution date approached in 2022, Atwood was given a choice: die by lethal injection or gas. But instead of the standard cyanide gas, he made an unusual request. He wanted to be executed using nitrogen gas. Arizona authorities denied this request, stating that lethal injection would proceed as planned. On June 8, 2022, Atwood was led into the execution chamber in Florence, Arizona. He lay strapped to the gurney, a priest standing beside him, holding a prayer book. In a calm voice, he spoke his final words: "I pray the Lord will have mercy on me." At 10:16 a.m., the execution began. The lethal drugs entered his system, and his breathing became shallow. His chest rose and fell slowly before stopping altogether. 8 minutes later, at 10:24 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Johnny Frank Garrett. On the morning of October the 31st, 1981, the quiet halls of the St. Cyr Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas, became the scene of a horrifying crime. Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old Catholic nun, was found sexually assaulted, strangled, and murdered inside her room. The crime shocked the local community and led investigators to a suspect, 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett, who lived across the street from the convent. 9 days later, on November 9th, Garrett was arrested and charged with the murder. The case against him moved quickly, and despite his young age, he was convicted and sentenced to death. From the start, Garrett's case was full of doubts. His defense team argued that the prosecution had relied on weak evidence and coerced confessions. Over the years, forensic experts and advocates claimed he had been wrongfully convicted, pointing out flaws in the investigation. In 1992, Pope John Paul II personally appealed for clemency on Garrett's behalf. Texas Governor Ann Richards temporarily delayed the execution, but the state's parole board ultimately rejected a commutation. With no more options left, Garrett's fate was sealed. On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was escorted to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. While official records state that he declined to make a last statement, reports from witnesses claim that he left one final defiant message. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me," he said. "The rest of the world can kiss my ever-loving ass." It was a bold and angry farewell from a man who had long claimed he was innocent. At 12:34 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Garrett took a few deep breaths before falling unconscious. He was pronounced dead minutes later. William Bonin. Between May 1979 and June 1980, William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer, carried out one of the most horrifying killing sprees in American history. Preying on young men and boys between the ages of 12 and 19, he lured his victims into his Ford Econoline van before subjecting them to unspeakable cruelty. Bonin's method of murder was gruesome. He restrained his victims with handcuffs, ropes, or cords before sexually assaulting them. Then, he would torture them, sometimes beating them with tire irons, stabbing them, or even forcing them to drink hydrochloric acid. His sadistic pleasure in hearing his victims scream revealed a level of brutality that shocked even seasoned investigators. His killing spree came to an end on June 11, 1980, when police caught him attempting to assault a 17-year-old boy. A search of his van revealed handcuffs, knives, and other tools of torture. He was arrested and later linked to at least 21 murders, though the real number is suspected to be higher. During his trial, Bonin showed no remorse. He even admitted that he enjoyed killing and that he only regretted being caught. The jury found him guilty of multiple murders, and in 1982, he was sentenced to death. He spent the next 14 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, making multiple unsuccessful appeals. As his execution date neared, Bonin made one of the most excessive last meal requests in history. He ordered 2 large pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. While most inmates use their last moments to reflect on their lives or express remorse, Bonin treated his final hours with the same selfishness that had defined his entire existence. Even in his last interview, he remained cold and detached. When asked if he felt regret, he simply said, "I couldn't stop killing," showing no concern for his victims or their families. On February the 23rd, 1996, Bonin was led to the execution chamber at San Quentin. Strapped to the gurney, he showed no emotion. At 12:13 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, and he was pronounced dead. Aileen Wuornos. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos carried out a series of murders along the highways of Florida, making her one of the rare female serial killers in history. Unlike most serial murderers, Wuornos didn't kill for pleasure. She claimed she did it out of survival. Working as a prostitute, she lured male clients before shooting them and stealing their belongings. 7 men fell victim to her gun. Some were shot multiple times, their bodies dumped along remote roadsides. Wuornos initially insisted that all the killings were in self-defense, claiming her clients had attempted to assault or rape her. But as time went on, her story changed. In later interviews, she admitted that not all of them had attacked her. Some were simply easy targets. In 1991, Wuornos was arrested after police linked her to the stolen car of one of her victims. Her lover and accomplice, Tyria Moore, struck a deal with police and convinced Wuornos to confess. The confession sealed her fate. Her trial was chaotic. She was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Over the years, her mental state deteriorated, and she became increasingly paranoid. She accused prison staff of poisoning her food and claimed the government wanted her executed as part of a larger conspiracy. On October 9, 2002, Wuornos was taken to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. As the drugs were prepared, she delivered one of the most bizarre final statements ever recorded. "Yes, I would just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." Her final words left many confused. Some believed she was referring to the return of Jesus, while others saw it as a sign of her worsening mental state. At 9:47 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Wuornos took a few deep breaths before closing her eyes. Moments later, she was pronounced dead. John Henry Ramirez. In 2004, John Henry Ramirez committed a crime that shook Corpus Christi, Texas. High on drugs, he and two women went on a robbery spree, looking for easy targets. That night, they spotted 46-year-old Pablo Castro, a convenience store worker, taking out the trash. Without warning, Ramirez attacked him, stabbing him 29 times over just $1.25. Castro died on the spot, left bleeding behind the store. Ramirez ran to Mexico, avoiding capture for nearly 4 years. But in 2008, authorities caught him. He was put on trial, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. While waiting for his execution, Ramirez changed. He turned to religion and started reading the Bible daily. As his execution date approached, he asked for one final thing: to have his spiritual advisor, Pastor Dana Moore, place a hand on him and pray out loud as he died. Texas prison officials denied this request, leading Ramirez to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court ruled in his favor, deciding that religious rights should be respected in the execution chamber. This decision set a legal precedent for future death row inmates. On October 5, 2022, Ramirez was led into the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. As planned, his pastor stood beside him, pressing a hand to his chest. Ramirez knelt in prayer, fulfilling his last request before facing death. Before the lethal injection, he turned to Pablo Castro's family. "I hope this gives you some comfort," he said. "If this helps you, then I am glad." Then, speaking to his loved ones, he added, "Just know that I fought a good fight and I am ready to go." At 6:27 p.m., the execution began. The drugs entered his body and within seconds, his breathing slowed. He began snoring and soon his body went still. 14 minutes later, at 6:41 p.m., CDT John Henry Ramirez was pronounced dead.